We're very honored to be offering a selection of images by the renowned French photographer Maurice Tabar. Tabar is someone who began making pictures in the 1920s, was clearly influenced by the surrealist idiom. And what's so fascinating about his body of work is that he was not afraid to experiment with different techniques and different ways of rendering the photograph. In this one picture, that's the elongated film strip called Solarization number 4, we see a series of images of a theatrical figure. And when we first look at this strip, it almost seems like the pictures are identical. And there's a repetition going on that's more of a conceptual repetition. But if we look at the images carefully, in fact, there are subtle differences from one frame to the next. And Tabar is someone who was interested in solarization, and obviously in this series we see the solarization of the figure, that kind of outline that gives the image more depth. He was interested in layering different negatives, sandwiching different negatives, which we see in this image of the woman who appears to be imprisoned or in some very restricted situation that's magnified by the abstract forms that hover and are superimposed over her. And then in this image, entitled Maigretisse, we see another solarized figure, this figure holding a guitar. In this particular example, it's the negative that Tabar solarized, and hence we have all these very negative and dark tones that are conveyed throughout the image. Solarization was more popularly used with the photographic paper, and what would transpire is the paper would be exposed to light for a fraction of a second in a wet darkroom situation, so it was somewhat controlled. It's a dark image, but it's an image with dimensionality and depth. And so Tabar is someone who's associated with the new French vision. He was influenced by surrealism, but I think in the group of images that we have here, we get to see the full breadth of his vision and how, whether it was solarization or montage or fashion, he just steps up to the plate, gives it his best, and creates these absolutely extraordinary photographs. Lot 323 is Imogen Cunningham's beautiful floral study entitled Tower of Jewels. The negative was created in 1925. The print is a 1930s print that was in her archive and is accompanied by a letter of authenticity from her son, Rondell Partridge. Cunningham was actually a very colorful figure in the history of photography. Born in Seattle, she actually apprenticed with Edward Curtis. And Cunningham decides that she loves photography, she wants to make a career as a photographer, and goes to Germany to study the craft and technique of picture making. She returns to California, meets Edward Weston, and realizes that there's an American modernist sensibility developing. Shortly after, Cunningham marries, she has a family, and so her life is pretty restricted in terms of where she can go and what she can do. And what does she decide to photograph but flowers, botanical images, floral images, and because she had learned the craft of making prints, her photographic prints are just amazing. They have a real magisterial quality in terms of how the tones of the print really sit in this kind of very fluid, very delicate grayscale. The Tower of Jewels is from the collection of Alexandra R. Marshall. And what this image does, what Cunningham does, is use an everyday object, in this case, floral imagery, and elevate it into a transcendental art form. This is the companion image to another picture called Magnolia Blossom, which Swann sold about 13 years ago for a record $227,000. I think when we look at Cunningham's sensibility and the fact that as a housewife, she went into her garden, she found these beautiful flowers, she saw the play of light and shadow, and understood by pre-visualizing these images what was possible to translate and convey in the photographic image. Lot 389 is Ansel Adams's majestic image, the Grand Tetons and the Snake River. Adams is the quintessential American landscape photographer. In this image, which was created in 1942, the print, which is a large format print, was done in the 1970s, we see an absolutely epic landscape. And I think that the composition of the landscape underscores Adams's genius and skill as a fine art photographer. But in addition to conveying the beauty of the landscape, there's something else going on in this image, which is Adams's sensitivity and recognition of the abstract forms of the landscape, and certainly the sinewy path of the river and how it leads our eye up into the Tetons, this sort of very ragged, jagged landscape with the dramatic sky above it, is quite a choreographed and masterful approach to making images and making photographs. This photograph is certainly one of his important images, an early image. Adams is someone who was so enamored of the possibilities in the darkroom and the musicality, because he was a trained classical pianist and really saw the negative as this sort of raw material and creating a score, as it were, in the darkroom that best interpreted that negative. And when we look at this photographic print, we see the time and care and energy in which he coaxes out these subtle details of the branch outlines in the foreground and leaves and the dramatic kind of details in the clouds, and then the Tetons themselves with the snow covering these jagged kind of mountaintops. And you realize that the negative is just the beginning. What the photographer decides to do, how the photographer decides to interpret that negative, is of course what fine art photography is all about. And Adams is the consummate professional, the storied printmaker, the legendary printmaker, the gold standard by which all other photographers measure their success.